What is stress? It's actually a collection of what I call micro traumas. And a person with chronic stress might manifest in the same way as somebody who's experienced war or natural disaster, accident, or even injury does. Now, many people come to therapy with no known trauma, but they still have the same symptoms as people who've experienced those traumatic experiences. Even with no identifiable trauma, many of these clients have the same difficulties. In the past, we might have attributed this to repressed trauma and gone on therapeutic fishing expeditions to discover their forgotten traumas. But that's not how the brain works. This video is about how the brain actually works. And in reality, a life of micro traumas begins to equal the full weight and scale of any other trauma. If we haven't had the chance to meet before, I'm Dr. Richard Nongard. Today, I'm talking about micro traumas and stress. Stress can be conceptualized like a pharmaceutical scale, where micro traumas are stacked on one side, and when enough of them are stacked, the scale eventually tips. It's at this point that the weight of these stressors equals the impact of large-scale trauma. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that a bad experience with a customer at work is the same thing as being injured by an IED. But there's no need in mental health for a competitive misery contest. What I'm stating is that the responses and the end result of both trauma and chronic stress look remarkably the same. So how do microtraumas work? Well, let's take the case of a grocery store clerk who has a negative encounter with a particularly vicious and threatening customer. When they go home from work and reflect back, they're bothered by the encounter. That night when they go to sleep, the brain processes these emotions and the encounter. It defragments them, it places them in the mental filing cabinet where they belong, and then they wake up the next morning largely forgetting the previous day's toxic stress. But a week or two later, while dining with friends, somebody at the table might share an experience from their work. This jogs the subconscious memory, and the person will then retrieve both the visual, emotional, and somatic revivification of the forgotten event. By doing so, the micro-trauma response is reinforced. Sometimes, through the mental process of deletions, distortions, and generalizations, it might even become amplified to a greater extent than the initial event, and the relived experience is perceived even more stressfully. Can you relate to this? Short-term memory retains these micro-traumas, which, compounded over time, accumulate a significant psychological burden. Now imagine over the course of a year working in that retail environment, there are numerous stressful workplace events, difficulty with other customers, difficulty with supervisors, transportation difficulties, and a paycheck that's less than the rate of inflation. All of these stressors from work and all the other computed life stressors, such as endless war on the TV news, economic uncertainty, the reality of dysfunctional families where we live, they create a net negative life experience in our example. It reminds me of the book Where the Wild Things Are, where it says, and in and out of weeks, almost over a year, to where the wild things are. In this case, the wild things are the island where micro-traumas rear their ugly heads. Well, each of these things in and of itself might be normal life. At the end of a period of chronic stress, in both mind and body, they hold the weight of compounded micro-traumas that's equal to any other type of trauma. Now, Professor van der Kolk says that the problem with trauma is that when it's over, your body relives it. In the case of chronic stress, the body relives it too. A stressful event might be over, but the brain continues to reactivate because neurons that wire together, fire together, the physical manifestations of stress, the emotional manifestations, and the psychological manifestations are intertwined, and the result is a constant state of hyperarousal. A trauma is different than stress, but stress is caused by micro-traumas, and it should be recognized as such, and the weight of chronic stress can equal the dangers of even severe PTSD. Van der Kolk has said, stress is not trauma, but there's evidence to the contrary. The effects of both PTSD and chronic stress are on par with each other. Chronic stress and PTSD both cause structural changes like reduced hippocampal size and increased amygdala activity. PTSD and chronic stress both show increased amygdala activity and decreased prefrontal cortex function, which disrupts emotional regulation. Both conditions involve disruptions in the HPA axis, although chronic stress typically leads to high cortisol levels, while PTSD shows a heightened cortisol sensitivity. But neuroimaging studies show that both PTSD and chronic stress exhibit increased amygdala activation and decreased prefrontal cortex regulation. Both PTSD and chronic stress are associated with anxiety and depression, but while PTSD also includes flashbacks and hypervigilance, chronic stress can lead to cognitive impairments, substance use, and yes, hypervigilance as well. If you toss a stone into a still lake, the rings of ripples continue to spread, altering the entire surface. Similarly, stress has a ripple effect that impacts not just our mental state, but also our physical health and behaviors. If you were to drop a basket full of pebbles onto the water at the same time, the ripples would overlap and intensify. This is similar to the effects of cumulative stress, where multiple stressors build on each other, leading to a more severe impact on our overall well-being. Yes, the stress response is not as observable as trauma, but the body continues to act like a dissipating wave from the initial stressful event. The results are the same: flight, or freeze. Van der Kolk says, after our traumas, our responses are about survival, and this is the same in chronic stress. Those who are chronically stressed are just surviving, and the instinct in what they do is about self-preservation, even though it's often deployed in ways that are self-defeating. Stress, microtraumas can lead to decreased immune function, increased inflammation, a higher risk for chronic diseases like heart disease and diabetes, and they can negatively impact our sleep, our eating habits, and the ability to cope with challenges. It can even lead to hopelessness and despair. Even though what we see is that PTSD and chronic stress share common effects on mind and body, they have similar solutions. What are these solutions? A proven set of strategies that include experiential somatic therapies, such as multi-channel eye movement integration, bilateral stimulation. These have both been shown to be effective in addressing both PTSD and chronic stress. These types of therapies are at the heart of our physical experiences with both big traumas and micro traumas. I've been saying throughout my career, we can only be as well emotionally as we are physically. And the most important truth that Van der Kolk shared with us in his writings is that the body does keep the score. Any therapy that fails to address the somatic means those things experienced by the body and of the body, of our experiences, will fail to be holistic. In other words, we can only truly heal from trauma and chronic stress when we address both the thinking, the psychological, as well as the somatic experiences of stress. Now, these types of approaches aren't really new. The father of modern neurology was Jean-Martin Charcot, who almost 200 years ago recognized that there was no dichotomy of mind, and the mind is the body. His approach to treating patients was with hypnosis, which is a somatic approach that both utilized and elicited behavioral, emotional, and physical responses. Sigmund Freud was a student of Charcot's. He was also a neurologist. He studied with him in Paris for several years, and he recognized this somatic dimension as key to understanding and healing from psychological distress. In recent years, we've seen a resurgence of these somatic therapies in the mainstream mental health field, along with EMDR, bilateral stimulation techniques. There are also methods like somatic experiencing and sensory motor psychotherapy that focus on the body's role in healing from trauma and chronic stress. These approaches recognize that our bodies hold on to the memories and emotions associated with traumatic experiences. And by working with the body in therapy, we can release and process these stored sensations and emotions. Additionally, incorporating somatic practices into our daily lives can have a profound impact on our well-being. Mindful movement practices like yoga or Tai Chi can help us to connect with our bodies and regulate our nervous systems. Biofeedback, autogenic training, and again, hypnotherapy allow us to end the mind-body duality and recognize that mind is actually in every cell of the body. And this is crucial for managing stress and promoting emotional well-being. It's also important to note that while these therapies can be incredibly beneficial, they might not be enough on their own. Life is complex. Whether you experienced a single traumatic event or are dealing with chronic microtraumas in our daily life, it's crucial to integrate both talk therapies, personal development, and somatic approaches so we can address the complexities of our mind and bodies and find true healing and balance. If you'd like to learn more about experiential somatic therapies or the brain science of hypnosis, like, subscribe, and share my videos with others. And please hit the subscribe button to be updated when I release new videos.